Hi everyone, here's another video on the fallacies of presumption, ambiguity, and grammatical analogy. And this time I want to talk about suppressed evidence. Suppressed evidence is a kind of argument where a person either intentionally or carelessly leaves out information that's vital. And it's a case where you actually have an argument that does provide evidence for a conclusion, but the person has, again, sort of either intentionally or unintentionally left out evidence that would defeat that. So there's another argument that defeats my conclusion. So even though I have an argument for my conclusion, um, there's this other argument which I should have realized, or I'm intentionally leaving it out. So let's say, for example, in a political ad, someone says, "Don't vote for Senator X. Senator X proposed a tax on 911 calls," and everyone says, "Well, a tax on 911 calls? That's terrible. How can you assess an extra tax on that?" And then what I don't mention is that this tax was only to be charged in cases where it becomes evident that it was a fraud. That says people were calling 911 um, and pranking it or calling it frivolously or whatever. So it was only to be assessed in fraudulent cases. They just left that out, right, conveniently. And maybe, there's a case where it seems like something someone might do intentionally, right? Um, Taking quotations out of context is another kind of suppressed evidence argument. So um, here's an example. I found a Ronald Reagan speech where he says, "They tell us," this is in the middle of the speech, of course, he's talking about opponents. "They tell us we must learn to live with less and teach our children that their lives will be less full and prosperous than ours have been." So now I quote that, right? And I just leave out the "they tell us" part, right? This is a really particularly egregious one that I found where you could do this. Suppose I just left out the "they tell us" and I say, according to Ronald Reagan, quote, "We must learn to live with less and teach our children that their lives will be less full and prosperous than ours have been." Right? And so, of course, he's talking about exactly the opposite of what he wants to go on to claim. But I'm quoting him as if this is his view. So that's a form of suppressed evidence because the information I'm leaving out is right the part of the quote right before that where he says, "They tell us." There's also such thing as a sort of careless suppressed evidence arguments. And sometimes people do this in daily life. I once witnessed a person mowing someone's lawn. It was clear that it wasn't his own lawn. He was mowing it probably for money. And there were dogs in the backyard. He was mowing the front yard, and they were barking furiously and sort of snarling at him. Clearly, the lawnmower was aggravating them. There were German shepherds, and this guy went over and stuck his arm behind the fence. I don't know if he was going to pet them or quiet them down or something, but they bit him. One of them, anyway, bit him. And it looked so ridiculous, like just somebody going over and shoving their hand behind this fence for this dog, for this snarling dog to bite him. It was obvious to me the dog was going to bite him, but it was he must have been thinking, he must have known the dogs, and he must have thought, he must have made the following argument to himself: "I know these dogs, I deal with these dogs all the time, they've never bit me, so they're not going to bit me right now, they're not going to bite me right now." And there's a careless ignoring of evidence against that that's right in front of you, that this dog is like snarling and barking, it's clearly very aggravated. So that's the thing that sometimes people do, where they don't seem to notice something that's right in front of their face, and we could think of that as another case of suppressed evidence. It's not it's very difficult to avoid doing this. Probably everyone does it now and then, but it still fits the description of this fallacy. So that's suppressed evidence. The next fallacy is called equivocation. Equivocating means that a person uses a word or phrase that has different meanings, and their statements sound true, but you only notice when you look more carefully that the statements only sound true if you take the word or phrase in different ways, in the different times that it appears. So let's say, for example, I make the argument, my car is a lemon, and lemons are yellow, so therefore my car is yellow. This is a silly example. We like to start with silly examples a lot of the time. And the statement, my car is a lemon, if you see my car, it seems like something true, right? It sounds like I'm saying something true to you if I say my car is a lemon. At the same time, when I say lemons are yellow, that also seems like something true. And then I'm putting the two together to get the conclusion that my car will be yellow. And the problem is that in order for that to work, the two occurrences of the word lemon have to mean the same thing. If it did mean the same thing, it wouldn't be true both times, of course. So then there's the problem with the argument. It's easy enough to spot this in a ridiculous case like this, but equivocation can actually be a pretty tricky fallacy. It's not always easy to spot different meanings of a word or phrase. In this case, lemon meaning a junker and lemon meaning a piece of fruit are so different that you're not going to get them mixed up. If you have a word or phrase that has different meanings but they're sort of similar, it can actually be tricky to spot the equivocation. Just as an example of this, sometimes in other philosophy classes, if we get into a discussion about the existence of God, and there are some famous arguments from the history of philosophy about whether you can prove the existence of God, and very often it comes up that someone sort of has this. They say that the existence of God can be established quite easily, and then it turns out that they have this definition of God that it's so broad that it includes things that are obviously real. So somebody will say, well, of course God exists. It can be established by evidence because God, I think, I think of God as just sort of energy. And of course there's energy. It's a scientific fact that there's energy. There wouldn't be anything in the universe wouldn't exist if there wasn't energy. So there, I mean, the person starts off by sort of announcing this conclusion that we can prove God exists, which sounds like a big deal conclusion. If you take it to mean the sort of personal supreme being that created the universe from nothing and so on. And then what they do is they sort of change the meaning of God to be just like energy, which is a much less, to conclude that there is energy is a much less impressive conclusion, right, than what we initially thought it was when they used the word God. So there's a sort of equivocation that may be involved there. Of course, the person giving the argument can always claim that they meant it the same way both times, and it's just our fault for taking them to have said something else that they didn't mean. Bill Clinton was accused of equivocating when he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," right? And later on, they find out there was a sexual relationship. And then he was confronted with that and asked, "Well, didn't you lie to the American people?" And so he said, "No. See, sexual relations, where I come from in Arkansas, that means one specific act. So that then he just maintains that that's what he meant all along, and it's everyone else's fault for misunderstanding, assuming when he said I did not have sexual relations that meant sexual contact of any kind. Similar kind of thing seems to be going on in the changing the meaning of God argument. So it's all that's the sneaky thing, or at least the tricky thing about equivocation. It's always possible to simply claim that's what you meant all along with an equivocation. If you have like a realistic case of equivocation, it's um, very hard to establish that an argument equivocated, and it can be tricky to spot as well.